David Letterman froze mid-sentence. Paul Schaefer's hand stopped on the key. 300 people in Studio 6A held their breath because in the third row, something impossible was happening. A 72-year-old man who hadn't spoken in 30 years, not a single word since Korea, not to his wife, not to his children, not even to himself, had just opened his mouth. His daughter was crying. His grandchildren were staring. And David Letterman, the king of late-night sarcasm, who never let anything touch him, was about to hear 3 words that would shatter everything he thought he knew about what his show meant. What happened next wasn't in any script. It couldn't be rehearsed, and it would become the most powerful moment in Letterman's 33-year career, not because of who spoke, but because of what 30 years of silence breaking sound like when it finally ends. It was March 1990. Late Night with David Letterman was in its 8th season on NBC, taping 5 nights a week from Studio 6A in Rockefeller Center. The show was a well-oiled machine. Letterman, now 43, had perfected his persona, the gap-toothed Midwestern cynic, the master of the raised eyebrow and the dismissive shrug. Nothing rattled the studio audience that Thursday night was typical. Tourists from the Midwest, college kids from NYU, a few older couples who'd won radio contest tickets. They came to laugh, to see celebrities, to be part of something they could tell their friends about. In the third row, seat 12, sat the Kowalski family from Buffalo, New York. There was Dorothy Kowalski, 68, gray-haired and gentle-faced, wearing a simple floral dress. Next to her sat her daughter Linda, 42, a high school guidance counselor with worried eyes, and between them sat Edward Kowalski, 72 years old, thin as a rail, with white hair and weathered hands that trembled slightly in his lap. Edward hadn't spoken since July 1960. 30 years of silence. Not selective mutism, not a medical condition that doctors could name, just silence. Edward Kowalski had come home from Korea in 1953, worked at the steel mill for 7 years, raised 2 kids, and then one day, in the summer of 1960, he simply stopped talking. No warning, no explanation. One morning he woke up, looked at Dorothy across the breakfast table, and his voice was gone. Not physically, doctors checked, but something inside him had closed like a fist and wouldn't open. For 30 years, Dorothy learned to read his eyes, his gesture. Linda and her brother grew up with a father who smiled some, who hugged them, who showed up to every school play and baseball game, but who never said a word. They tried every therapist, medication, even a priest. Nothing worked. Edward Kowalski lived in a prison of his own silence, and no one knew why. But there was one thing that made him almost smile. Every night at 11:30, Edward would sit in his recliner in the living room, and Dorothy would turn on Late Night with David Letterman. And for that hour, Edward's face would soften, his shoulders would relax. Sometimes, if Letterman hit a joke just right, Edward's mouth would twitch upward, not quite a smile, but close. Dorothy noticed, Linda noticed. It was the only time Edward seemed present, seemed almost like the man he'd been before Korea, before whatever happened there stole his voice. He loves that show, Linda had told her mother 100 times. It's the only thing that reached. So when Linda won 4 tickets to a late night taping through a radio contest, she knew exactly what she had to do. "We're taking Dad to see David Letterman," she told her mother. Dorothy was hesitant. "He doesn't like crowds, Linda." "He hasn't been to the city in years, Mom," Linda said firmly. "It's the only thing that makes him happy. We have to try." So they drove 6 hours from Buffalo to Manhattan. Edward sat in the back seat, staring out the window, silent as always. But when they pulled up to 30 Rockefeller Plaza, and Linda said, "Dad, we're going to see David Letterman live," something flickered in Edward's eye. Recognition, maybe even excitement. Studio 6A was everything Linda had imagined. The bright light, the energy, the famous set she'd seen on TV 1,000 times. Paul Schaefer and the band were warming up. The audience was buzzing with anticipation. Edward sat between Dorothy and Linda, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the stage. He looked small in the theater seat, fragile, but he was alert in a way Linda hadn't seen in years. The show began exactly on time. The announcer's voice boomed. Paul Schaefer launched into the theme, and then David Letterman walked out, curly brown hair, charcoal suit, that trademark grin, and the audience erupted. Letterman did his monologue, jokes about George Bush, about the economy, about New York City. The audience ate it up. Paul Schaefer laughed at all the right moments. Everything was running like clock. Linda glanced at her father. Edward was staring at Letterman with an intensity she'd never seen before. His lips were moving slightly, like he was trying to form words that wouldn't come. The monologue ended. Letterman introduced his first guest, some actor promoting a movie Linda didn't recognize. The interview was fine. Funny enough, the audience laughed. But halfway through, Letterman did something unexpected. He stopped the interview, turned to the audience, and said, "You know what? I want to take a minute here. I got a letter this week that I can't stop thinking about." The actor looked confused. Paul Schaefer glanced up from his keyboard. Letterman pulled a piece of paper from his jacket pocket. This letter is from a woman in Ohio, Letterman said. Her father is a veteran, Vietnam. He's been struggling with what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. She says he doesn't talk much anymore, doesn't sleep well, but she says every night he watches this show, and for an hour, he seems okay. Letterman's voice soft. She wanted me to know that. She said, Mr. Letterman, you probably don't realize it, but you're helping my dad survive just by being there, just by making him laugh. The studio was quiet now. Letterman folded the letter carefully. I don't know if that woman's watching tonight, but if you are, thank you for telling me, because sometimes I forget what this show is for. It's not just joke. It's not just entertainment. Sometimes it's a life. He looked out at the audience. If anyone here tonight has a veteran in their life, or anyone who's struggling, tell them they matter. Tell them you see them, because silence is a killer. In the third row, Edward Kowalski's hands began to shake. His wife reached for it, but he pulled away. His mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water, and Linda, sitting beside him, felt her entire world tilt because she realized was trying to speak. It started as a sound low guttural, like a rusted gate trying to open. Dorothy heard it first. She turned to Edward, her eyes wide. Eddie? Linda grabbed her father's. Dad, are you okay? Edward's face was red. His whole body was trembling. Tears were streaming down his weathered cheek. And then, for the first time in 30 years, Edward Kowalski spoke. Bang! 2 words, barely a whisper, cracked and rough like broken glass. But everyone in the third row heard it. Dorothy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Linda started crying immediately. The people around them turned, confused by the commotion. On stage, Letterman had moved on. He was bantering with Paul Schaefer about something, the audience laughing again. But Linda couldn't wait. She stood up, her voice shaking. Mr. Letterman! The laughter stopped. Letterman looked up, surprised. Yes, my father. Linda's voice broke. My father just spoke. He hasn't spoken in 30 years, and he just spoke because of what you said. The studio went completely silent. Letterman stepped out from behind his desk. I'm sorry. What? Linda was openly sobbing. My father is a Korean War veteran. He came home in 1953, and in 1960, he just stopped talking complete. For 30 years, he hasn't said a single word. But just now, when you talked about veterans, she said thank you. He spoke. Letterman's face went pale. Paul Schaefer set down his guitar. He's here? Letterman asked quietly. Right here, Dorothy said, standing, her arm around Edward, who was shaking like a leaf. Letterman didn't hesitate. He walked off the stage, down the step, into the audience. The cameras followed, but this wasn't planned. The producers in the booth were frantically talking into headsets, but Letterman ignored them. He walked directly to the third row and stopped in front of Edward Kowalski. Edward looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, still crying silently. Sir, Letterman said, and his voice was thick with emotion. What's your name? Edward's mouth moved. Nothing came out at first. He tried again. Edward, he rasped. Edward Kowalski. Dorothy sobbed. Linda covered her face with her hand. Letterman knelt down, so he was eye level with Edward. Edward, how long were you in Korea? Edward's voice was barely audible, each word seeming to cost him every 2 years. Chosin Reservoir. The audience drew in a collective breath. Anyone who knew history knew what that meant. The Chosin Reservoir was one of the bloodiest battles of the Korean War. Brutal cold, impossible odds, thousands dead. And you haven't spoken since when? Letterman asked Jim. 1960, Edward whispered. July. That's 30 years, Letterman said. Edward nodded. Why? Letterman asked. What happened? Edward's face crumpled. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, haltingly, painfully, the words came. I saw too much. Did things I couldn't talk about, so I stopped talking at all. Letterman's eyes were wet. And tonight? Why tonight? Edward looked at him directly. Because you said silence is a killer. And you're right. I've been dead for 30 years. But you, his voice broke. Every night, you made me feel alive. Like maybe I could still be human. What Letterman did next wasn't in any manual. There was no protocol for this. But in that moment, David Letterman stopped being a talk show host and became something else. A healer. A bridge back to the world for a man who'd been lost for 3 decades. Letterman stayed kneeling in front of Edward for a long moment. Then he did something that made the entire studio hold its breath. He took Edward's trembling hands in his own. Edward, Letterman said, I need you to listen to me. What you saw in Korea, what you did, that doesn't make you less human. That makes you a survivor. And the fact that you came back, that you raised a family, that you kept going even when you couldn't speak, that makes you a hero. Edward shook his head. More tears followed. I'm not a hero. Yes, you are, Letterman said firmly, and I'm going to prove it. He stood up and addressed the studio audience. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Edward Kowalski. He's a Korean War veteran. He fought at Chosin Reservoir. He came home and lived 30 years in silence because of what he experienced. And tonight, right here in this room, he found his voice again. The audience didn't know what to do at first. Then someone in the back started clapping. Then someone else. And then The entire studio erupted not in applause, but in a standing ovation that shook the wall. Edward looked around, stunned. Dorothy was crying so hard she could barely stand. Linda was holding her father's other hand, repeating over and over, "You did it, Dad. You did it." Letterman turned to Paul Schaefer. "Paul, give me some." Paul nodded, his own eyes wet, and began playing the soft, gentle version of America the Beautiful. Letterman helped Edward to his feet. "Can you walk with me?" he asked. Edward nodded. Slowly, with Letterman supporting him, Edward Kowalski walked from the third row, up the aisle, and onto the stage of Late Night with David Letterman. The audience lost. People were openly weeping. The cameras captured every second. When they reached the desk, Letterman pulled out his own chair. "Sit here," he said. Edward sat, overwhelmed, in David Letterman's chair behind the famous desk. Letterman stood beside and looked into the camera. "This is Edward Kowalski," he said. "For 30 years, he watched this show from his living room in Buffalo, New York. He never thought he'd be here. Never thought he'd speak again. But tonight, he is. And tonight, he did." He turned to Edward. "What do you want to say?" "Anything. The whole country is listening." Edward looked at the camera. His voice was stronger now, each word coming easier than the last. "I want to say to anyone out there who's in the dark, who can't find their voice, don't give up. It took me 30 years, but I'm here. And if I can come back, anyone can." The studio erupted again, applause rolling through the room in a warm, rising swell, not the explosive kind that comes from a punchline landing, but the kind that grows out of shared humanity. It lingered in the air, almost hesitant to fade, as if the audience collectively understood they were witnessing something rare. Letterman kept his hand on Edward's shoulder a moment longer, grounding them both. "Thank you," he said, and those two words carried a tenderness he rarely showed on camera. But the night wasn't done with, not even close. What followed in the final minutes would move from episode footage to legend, recounted in articles, interviews, and memories, not because of humor or spectacle, but because Letterman somehow gave back to a man who had been wandering in silence and sorrow for 3 decades. After the break, Edward returned to the stage with Dorothy and Linda beside him. They settled into the guest chair, sitting close, drawing quiet strength from each other. And from that moment forward, the show abandoned its blueprint. Cue cards were ignored. The band waited for cues that never came, and Letterman set aside the machinery of late-night television entirely. He wasn't performing anymore. He was listening. He asked Dorothy what it had meant to spend her life next to Edward's silence. She spoke gently, choosing each word with care. She talked about learning to read the language of small gestures, the way he'd rest a hand on her back when words failed, the way he'd fix things around the house without being asked, the way he showed up for every school event even if he never spoke during any of them. "He loved loudly," Dorothy said softly, "just quiet." When he asked Linda what she wanted her father to know, her voice broke. She said she had always believed he was still in there, that she felt his presence in every quiet nod, every fleeting smile. "I knew you were waiting for the right moment," she whispered, "and I'm so glad tonight was that moment." Finally, Letterman turned to Edward and asked about Korea, about Chosin, about the things he had buried so deeply that they had stolen his voice. At first, Edward's sentences were short, fragmented, but slowly, almost miraculously, they lengthened, turning into fuller stories, details returning like thawing ground after a long winter. He talked about the freezing night, the brothers he lost, the moments that carved themselves into his memory so brutally that speaking about them felt like reopening an old wound. "I thought if I talked about it," Edward said, "I'd fall apart, so I just stopped talking about anything." Letterman nodded gently. "But you didn't fall apart. You held on." "I survived," Edward said, "but surviving isn't living." "What about now?" Letterman asked. Edward turned to Dorothy and Linda, two people who had never stopped believing in him, before looking back at Letterman. "Now, I think I might try living again." The applause that followed was soft, reverent, a room full of strangers somehow united in witnessing a man step back into his own life. Then came the gesture that would define the night. Letterman walked to his desk and picked up one of his iconic white NBC mugs, the one that had been at his side for years. He carried it back to Edward with both hands, offering it the way one might offer a keepsake. "This is for you," Letterman said. "Every time you look at it, remember tonight. Remember that you found your voice. Remember that you matter, that you came back." Edward accepted the mug with hands that trembled not with fear, but with the overwhelming weight of meaning. He studied it slowly, as if imprinting every detail into memory. Then he lifted his eyes and said, with a clarity that startled the room, "Thank you, David." The name David landed with the intimacy of old friends. It broke something open in Letterman. His composure slipped, and he pulled Edward into a tight, heartfelt hug. The audience watched in stunned silence as two men, one at the height of fame, the other reclaiming the pieces of his life, held onto each other. When they finally separated, Letterman turned to the camera, his voice steady but full of emotion. "If you're watching at home, and you're struggling. If you're carrying something you think you can't say, please talk to someone. You don't have to carry it alone. Edward carried it for 30 years, and tonight he put it down. You can too. Paul Shaffer played the closing theme slower, almost hymn-like, as the credits rolled over an image of Letterman, Edward, Dorothy, and Linda, hands intertwined. Long after the cameras cut, after the audience drifted out into the night, Edward Kowalski remained on the stage. He stood there quiet, holding the mug like it was something sacred, looking around as if trying to convince himself it wasn't a dream. And Letterman stayed with side by side in the empty studio, not as a host, not as a celebrity, but simply as a man bearing witness to a miracle.